Welcome to the Lifeworks Living Well podcast. I'm your host, Mark Hennick. May is a big time for mental health. It's Mental Health Month in the United States. The first week is Mental Health Week in Canada, and the week after that is Mental Health Awareness Week in the UK, among other events that are happening all around the world. So I think this is a good time to broaden our understanding of what mental health actually is, to go back to basics, since it's always an evolving concept. Today, I'm going to take a look at this through two lenses: workplaces specifically, and society more generally. Later on in the show, I'm going to be joined by Daryl Tol from the California-based mental health nonprofit One Mind. We're going to talk about their One Mind at Work initiative and the progress that we've been making toward changing minds and supporting people in that context. But first, Dr. Thomas Insel is a psychiatrist and neuroscientist who, for more than a decade, led NIMH, the National Institute of Mental Health. In that role, he oversaw the deployment of billions of dollars in research funding to better understand the biological basis of mental health. But in his new book, Healing: Our Path from Mental Illness to Mental Health, he writes, "Our science was looking for causes, while the effects of these disorders were playing out with more death and disability, incarceration and homelessness, and increasing frustration and despair for both patients and families." As a result of his more than 45 years on the front lines and at the highest levels of mental health care, Dr. Insel has become a vocal advocate for a much broader social understanding of mental health, as well as the true causes of mental illnesses, beyond strict biological determinism. He joins me now on the Living Well podcast.
Oh, Mark, thanks for having me. And it is timely. This is a moment when a lot of us are focusing on mental health issues. So thanks for increasing and amplifying that message.
Well, now, first of all, of course, you've been amplifying that message for a very long time. And I've told you already, but I want to tell you on the record as well how much I enjoyed reading your book. I'm an avid reader, especially in psychology, neuroscience, sociology. And in my humble opinion, I said on Twitter, Healing is the most important book of the decade on mental health. And I don't say that lightly. I think I'm hard to impress. So thank you for writing it.
Oh, I'm touched and honored, especially coming from you, because you've got a broad perspective on this. I'm not a writer or a journalist. I wrote this book because I was trying to figure something out, and that's a good way to approach a book when you're confused and you just start writing things down to try to figure them out. And that actually became finally the book that got published.
Well, that's what struck me most about it, I think. You draw upon your vast experience clinically as well as in research and policy. You bring it all together, but it's not you talking to the reader like you're an expert and you have all the solutions. It's actually almost self-corrective in a way. It's kind of what you learned from your experience, what the mistakes or the misunderstandings that you had, which you're very candid about. No regrets, of course, or everybody has regrets, but you took together everything that you learned to try to almost give a cautionary tale of how we can go forward. So I'm interested in knowing what motivated you at this point in your career to do that, to write that book, to bring that knowledge together in such a synthesized, I think, helpful way.
It started with confusion. It started with this insight that we had made a lot of progress on the science and that we had good things to offer. And that when I talked to individual providers, they felt they were doing really well. And yet the population data didn't reflect that. Suicides were up in the US about 30% since 2000, 35% in some demographics. Morbidity in terms of unemployment, incarceration, homelessness, lack of recovery was worse. And in fact, in contrast to so many other areas of medicine, it began to really seem to me that we were doing worse now than when I had come into the field 40 plus years ago. That's not true for so many other areas. And I couldn't square that with the reality that, we had made real progress and that we have good medications, good psychotherapies, now neuromodulatory treatments. We have all sorts of rehabilitative interventions that work really well. It didn't add up. It didn't make sense. And that's why I started saying, what's going on here. And to do that, I had to kind of break out of my comfort zone. And so instead of talking to providers and people in the care system, I ended up going to jails and prisons and homeless shelters and clubhouses and meeting with lots of people who were not in the care system, including family members who actually, they're what I often call involuntary experts. They taught me a huge amount about where this system isn't working.
Mm. Now, you describe the mental health care system in America as actually a mental sick care system. And that really resonated with me because I think that's true here in Canada and around the world as well. But tell me what you actually mean by that. What is a mental sick care system?
Well, particularly in the United States, and to be fair, I was more focused on the US, although a lot of these lessons I think apply elsewhere. Healthcare broadly, not just mental health care, but healthcare is a business, right? It is. So if you want to understand it, you follow the money, and the money flows to the way that care is most intensive, most expensive, often least effective, which is around a crisis. What you see in the United States is that almost everything we built is to manage crisis, not to preempt the crisis, and often not even to do a great job following up on the crisis, but managing the illness when it is in some ways the most difficult to address. So it is really built around being sick. It's not, people aren't incentivized either as providers or patients to be healthy. It's a sick care system, although I have to say that a lot of the people I spoke to said it's not even a system. It's too chaotic. It's so fragmented. To call it a system is really overstating the amount of organization that's there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you make the point several times in the book that we know what recovery requires, that we have the tools, we have the knowledge. And I think we spend so much time, talking about how we need more research. We don't know what causes these issues. There's not enough doctors. We'll come back in a second. But you said that we know what recovery requires. So why aren't we doing it? If we have the knowledge, what's the barrier to action?
That's really the key question that I kept struggling with, because we're spending a huge amount of money on care itself. In the US, that the sort of canonical number has been 3.5 trillion, but with COVID, that's probably closer to 4 trillion. Over 18% of our GDP goes into the care system. We have all these other things that I'll call broadly rehabilitative services or preventive services that we know are actually pretty effective. In the book, I talk about just one example where, and this is based on a meta-analysis of many, many studies, that if you provide appropriate mental health care to women in the third trimester of pregnancy, you can reduce depression, anxiety, the mental health consequences of the postpartum period by about 50%. That's a big, big prevention effect, but we don't pay for that. In fact, almost by regulation in the United States, to get paid for something in the healthcare system, one must have a diagnosis or a CPT code. So you've already ruled out prevention. The whole concept of prevention is you want to provide the services before someone has that CPT code, before they have the diagnosis. We have to rethink all of this, I think, in a much more holistic way, to ask what works, what actually gets us to a state of health or mental health, and how do we build that in. So in the case of prevention, a lot of that means moving upstream, providing services in schools and community centers, and creating a different center of gravity for what we're doing in terms of care, broadening out what we mean by care. The other end, looking at recovery services, there's so much that we know is really effective. ACT teams, clubhouses, a whole range of supported housing, supported employment, all of this stuff we've had evidence for decades, 3 decades, that this is very effective and often cost effective. It's not paid for generally through healthcare dollars. And that's, I think, kind of, penny wise and pound foolish. We end up spending a lot of money on things that get us through an acute crisis, but we're not investing in something that will actually preempt the next crisis and allow us to save money downstream.
Mm. Now, you've said that healthcare itself only explains about 10% of the outcomes. But I think we invest so much, of course, into healthcare because of this idea that mental health advocates and mental health organizations have been trying to advance for years, which is that mental illness is just like physical illness, that depression is just like cancer. I think the original intent there was for, as the Brits say, parity of esteem or of equity. So in your view, as a psychiatrist, as a clinician, and as a researcher, are mental illnesses and physical illnesses really the same? Can we collapse that difference?
Oh, Mark, you're getting to the really hard question that I struggled with for a long time. I mean, I had spent 4 decades making the case that there is nothing different between mental illness and any physical illness. These are brain disorders. And I still think that is true. But, and here's the caveat, we have to think more broadly, I think, than the way we approach typical medical illnesses. So the way I've framed it in the book is that we have this medical model for the way we've approached mental illness, and it hasn't worked because it doesn't include prevention and recovery. It's really mostly about health care and not about health, or mental health care and not about mental health. And a central theme of the book is that if we care about mental health, we have to talk about more than mental health care. We have to get broader, and we have to think about both upstream and downstream impacts. Where I ended up, and it's kind of the tagline for the book, is that, yes, indeed, the problem is medical. These are brain disorders, and they should have the same parity. They should have the same reimbursement, the same rigor, the same science, the same support we have for any other part of medicine. So the problem is medical, but the solutions are much more. They're relational, they're environmental, they're even political. It gets back to this idea of, what do we mean by recovery? If that's the goal, it's not just symptom relief, but it's helping people to thrive. How do we get there? And what I talk about in the book is what I call the 3 Ps: people, place, and purpose. Social support, having the sanctuary and place to recover, and giving people, or helping people, to find a reason, empowering them with purpose, with a mission, with something to live for, something to recover for. We don't do that in the healthcare system. And what I'm calling for in the book is reframing what we mean by care so that it includes the 3 Ps. I think at that point, you're somewhat different than the way we would approach pneumonia, or maybe even asthma, or cardiovascular disease. It's a little broader. And I didn't get there easily. I got there reluctantly, but it was just looking at our failure to bend the curve on morbidity and mortality and realizing we've got to do more than just hand out medication. That's not care. That's an acute crisis response. It's a little bit of healthcare, and it may be sufficient for an infectious disease, not sufficient for a mental illness.
I think that the idea of recovery is still surprisingly radical in the mental health space. There's lots of people who believe that recovery isn't possible, when in fact the science tells us that recovery is not only possible, it's expected and it's likely from the vast majority of mental health problems and illnesses, even some severe and persistent ones. But I think that that's almost maybe an externalization of the insidious nature of many mental illnesses themselves, which almost keep themselves inside you, right? You mentioned how anxiety includes avoidance. Well, what perpetuates anxiety is the avoidance, or depression contains hopelessness. So you don't bother reaching out because you don't think anybody can help you. And that's part of the illness itself. So to what degree then, we're approaching the line between individual liberty and decision-making. Is there a role for involuntary treatment, for example, in healthcare settings? And how do you overcome the barrier that's part of the illness inside of somebody?
This is one of these really difficult problems that we wrestle with here. We actually wrestle with it in lots of areas of medicine. So we obviously, For very young children, we do involuntary treatment all the time. And for demented elders, we do the same thing. But we've really struggled with somebody who has a psychotic illness, who doesn't think they're ill, and yet consensually everyone else around who sees them hallucinating and delusional, highly paranoid, potentially dangerous, feels that they, in fact, have an illness. Again, I struggled with this a little bit, and there's a whole chapter in the book about how should we think about this. Do we allow people to die with their rights on, in the civil libertarian sense, or do we take over like we would a demented elder and say, we have to do something for you because the illness has robbed you of your own ability to help yourself? I come down on that latter perspective. It's a little simplistic, and it's not, it's not ideal, but there's a way in which this ancient concept of demonic possession almost fit many people who have serious mental illness, who have a psychotic illness that robs them of judgment and insight. It's as if they've been taken over in some way. And I've begun to feel that to the extent that we allow those people to remain homeless, eating out of dumpsters and listening to voices that are guiding them to do things that aren't helpful, to the extent that we allow that, we're really siding with the demon and ignoring the person, whether it's even just 2% of them that remains healthy. Most people, when they recover, their perspective on this is, why the hell did you let me go through all of that? All of this was preventable. And how could you not see that? How could you ignore me and side with the illness? How could you allow the illness to perpetuate my disability instead of saying, there's someone in there, there's someone there who we can relate to and who we need to save? And so we're having this debate in California in a very intense way now around this concept of care courts, which is providing involuntary treatment even earlier. I don't know where that will end up. I think it's an important conversation to have. And I think as we have the conversation, it's going to be critical for everyone to understand the actual insidious nature of these illnesses. And they are diseases. And to really understand, as you were saying before, Mark, just how they in some ways preempt their own treatment, and how when you have an illness like this, it so much gets in the way of recovery that in some ways that's the enemy. That's the biggest problem to helping people recover. It's why they don't get into treatment. It's why they don't want to stay in treatment often. And it's why we often fail to understand what they need to get better.
And I don't even think it's always, in fact, it's often not a capacity issue. People can not lose their decision-making capacity, but still have their decision-making influenced by their symptoms, by their suffering. That's all of our decisions, of course, whether we're sick or not, are influenced by our emotions. So, one of the things I think is the greatest tragedy is that we know that suicide is preventable if we can get contact with people who are suicidal and try to treat some of the underlying causes. You spend quite a bit of time in the book talking about the zero suicide movement, which I think is incredibly promising. But we also know that a sizable portion of people are actually in contact with a healthcare provider in the month or so before they die by suicide. So what's happening here? Is there, most people talk to their GP or they see a ER staff for triage. Is it a lack of training in suicide screening? Is it stigma within the healthcare system that, you don't want to, they're just attention seeking and you don't want to give it to them? What's going on here that we're getting a chance to potentially help people, but for whatever reason, they're falling through the cracks?
Yeah, there are a couple different kinds of data sets. Some of the data would say that up to 60% of people who die by suicide they're not in specialty care. They may have been in primary care. There's also data that says that when you do a suicide screen and they've gotten that in primary care, that some 70% of the people who die had denied being suicidal. And it gets back to your point about how difficult this whole terrain can be. It's really tricky because you're talking to the illness often. That's really not working in the person's best interest. I think the suicide is ultimately going to be an incredibly difficult problem to solve. And to get back to our earlier conversation, it may be one of those areas where the care system, as we think about it now, isn't going to be completely successful. You're going to have to take a public health approach, move upstream, and think about how to provide more limited access to means, whether that's firearms or nets under bridges or safer cars that don't have carbon monoxide emissions. There are a whole range of things that we ought to be doing that are before healthcare. They're before the crisis. They actually make it more difficult. And a lot of people have said, well, if somebody really wants to kill themselves and they go to a bridge and the bridge now has a barrier, they'll just find a different bridge. And that makes a lot of sense to me. But weirdly, the data don't support it. That when people have studied this, and there's a famous study done in Washington, D.C., where the Duke Ellington Bridge had become an iconic place to jump. And they put up a barrier so people couldn't jump off of it. There's another bridge, like 400 meters further south on the Potomac River, same kind of bridge. You could jump from that. People didn't do it. So there's some odd aspects to suicide that suggest that public health interventions can be actually very effective. We're not using them. We're not doing them. And we need to get serious about this. Because again, if we simply try to make sure that we do screening in primary care and we intervene for everyone who screens positive, we'll probably get some reduction, but we're not going to bend the curve in the way that we need to. We won't even get back to where we were probably in the year 2000. So that's where this public health approach becomes so important.
Now, part of that, I think, so often when these debates come up about what we need to fill those gaps, whether it's from a public health perspective or in a primary care setting or a tertiary care setting, it always comes up that we need more providers. There's a psychiatrist shortage, a social worker, a psychologist, a counselor shortage, whatever it is. But you seem to push back a bit on that idea in the book. So let me ask you, A, do we need more mental health professionals? And to put a finer point on it, given limited public funding in particular, is hiring more mental health professionals the best bang for the buck? Is that the best way to use the money?
Well, I assume that, because I've always heard this, that we needed a lot more people in the workforce. And so as part of the book, I actually started trying to understand, well, how many people do we have? I knew the number of psychiatrists, which is about 38,000, I think maybe 40,000 in the US, probably an equivalent percentage in Canada. Child psychiatrists, I think there's 7,000. The numbers are pretty limited. Same in Canada, by the way. And so I thought that, that is a pretty low number given what the ultimate burden of illness is. But if one looks more broadly, and I use the data from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration in the United States, the number for, if you start to include therapists broadly, so social workers, family therapists, the whole broad range of psychologists, it's much greater. It's something like 700,000. And just for context, there are about 200,000 primary care providers in the United States, about 200,000 dentists. So 700,000 is not a huge workforce shortage. You'd have to argue that, if you just think about the number, if every one of those people were dedicated to helping those with serious mental illness, there'd be one person for every 20 people with serious mental illness in the United States. But that's pretty good. Of course, the problem is that most of those people who are counted in that kind of a survey are doing very limited, usually it's fee-for-service practice with a small psychotherapy practice. Many of them are on the coast. They're not in the heartland, so they're not geographically evenly distributed. And what I talk about in the book is the kind of inconvenient truth that most of them have not been trained to provide the treatments that work, whether those are evidence-based psychological therapies or many of them, most of them can't provide medication. So that we have things that are very helpful, but they don't match with the workforce that we have. It's kind of astounding because one would never countenance that in any other part of medicine. Hard to believe that you'd have hundreds of thousands of people who were licensed to help those with cancer who didn't have the training to be able to do that. And yet that's really what we face here. So we do have a challenge, I think, in retraining our own workforce to give them the tools they need. And that's part of where I think that shortage and that gap between supply and demand comes. Yes, we have this huge supply. We also have an enormously increasing demand for services, but the demand is often for services that the workforce isn't prepared to supply. And that's where we're really feeling the pain. I'm quite hopeful, and the book is very hopeful. I hope. I mean, I felt it was. I came out of this book feeling like, wow, we can do this. But this is one place where technology can help us. It's helping us already by democratizing care, making sure that it doesn't matter whether you live in a rural area or an urban area, you can access someone who is licensed to provide psychotherapy. And then the great thing about technology is you can see what they're doing and you can improve the quality of care. And you can also train people to give much, much better care than what they've been doing. You can do that remotely. So I'm really hopeful that more and more of that 700,000 person workforce will begin to serve the needs, particularly of young people who are flocking into therapy from all over and who are looking for not only the chance to have someone to speak to, but the chance to also connect with others. And so the other place where I think we can do so much better in terms of closing that gap between supply and demand, closing that workforce issue, is in new forms of interventions online. So providing group therapy, providing social support online, bringing in peers and training those people who first come looking for care, training them to be able to help others and to become providers as well as recipients of care. My last company, Humanist Care, did just that. Our whole goal was to empower people to help each other. A little bit like AA, but not for substance abuse here, but for a whole range of different kinds of distress. And what we discovered was there's probably nothing more therapeutic than giving somebody a chance to help somebody else. We know that as providers, but we don't, in the healthcare system, we don't empower people to do that. We keep them in that position of just being recipients of care and not as providers. But they can do it, and they do it well, and they do it effectively. And it does allow us to, in many ways, solve that dilemma around there's not a psychiatrist ready to see me in the next 48 hours. We can fix that.
You mentioned hope there, and I think it was a hopeful book, first of all, and I think there are a lot of reasons to be hopeful. When I hear the stories and look at people like myself, who they shouldn't have to get through the system through grit and determination. It should be easier than it is, but it actually makes me really hopeful to see that people are able to fight back and advocate for what they need. And I think especially the healthcare system doesn't always recognize its own position of power, especially with respect to vulnerable people who don't know that they can ask for and even demand what they need. So, for any family members or individuals who are struggling with their mental health, who are watching this or listening to this, how would you suggest is the most effective way for them to self-advocate, given the reality that we have a broken sick care system? How can they make that system work as best as they can for them?
But there's a lot of education to be had here, and one of the great things about the internet is obviously there's a lot of garbage, but there are sites that are worth looking at, and in the book I have an entire list of which sites one should access to get the best information. I would say that if you're looking for therapy or you're looking even for medication, you can get access to this no matter where you live much more quickly than you could in the past. And there are many, many companies that have come on board during the pandemic to make sure that people have access to remote care. And again, the great thing about this is you have more choice than ever before. So you can find a therapist who is culturally matched to wherever you're coming from, speaks the same language, understands that set of issues. Sometimes there are groups available for that. It's remarkable, actually, how much is available currently. Some of it taking insurance, some of it not. But again, on this theme of hope, I think while unquestionably the internet has created a whole range of problems for us in this particular area, it's also created some great innovative opportunities. And I think for people who are struggling, the days of having to wait 3 to 4 weeks to see somebody in a brick and mortar office, and sometimes 3 to 4 months, more likely in the United States, those days are over. You can now access care within 24, 48 hours max. And sometimes that care can be just as good as what you would be able to get, sometimes better than in a brick and mortar office.
Dr. Thomas Insel, former head of the National Institute of Mental Health. New book is Healing: Our Path from Mental Illness to Mental Health. Dr. Insel, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Mark, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
We'll be right back right after this with Daryl Tol from One Mind. Stay tuned.
In our changing world, there is an unchanging principle for success that inspires us. By improving a person's life, we'll improve how they perform at work. We are Lifeworks. We are the world's leading total well-being provider. We are innovators with tech-enabled solutions. Our mission is to improve people's lives by supporting the whole person, their mental, financial, physical, and social well-being. These people are the heart of successful organizations, leading these organizations to a more resilient future and making a real difference in the world and in our communities. Improving lives, improving business. We are Lifeworks.
Welcome back to the Lifeworks Living Well podcast. I'm your host, Mark Hennick. Most of us spend more waking hours at work than just about anywhere else. So it makes sense for us to narrow our conversation a little bit on that rather unique context, the workplace. In order to do that, I'm going to be joined by Daryl Tol. Daryl is Executive Vice President of One Mind, a leading brain health nonprofit committed to healing the lives of people impacted by brain illness and brain injury. He joins me now from California. Daryl, thanks for being here.
Hey, Mark. Great to be here.
So why don't we start, first of all, with learning a little bit more about what One Mind actually is? What's the organization's backstory, and what are you working to accomplish?
One Mind was a family's passion project around their own experience. The Staglin family, Garen and Sherry, had a son, Brandon, who, as a teenager and in his early 20s, had a very significant struggle that ultimately was diagnosed as schizophrenia. And they realized, even with plenty of resources, it's so hard to get effective treatment, that they started a music festival to raise money for science. And that music festival continues to this day, but became One Mind. One Mind is focused on building and deepening science around brain research, brain health, how the mind functions, thriving. And it's continued to grow because they've noticed that even if the science is building, the application of science to reality is really, really not working well. And so we've started our media efforts, we've started our workplace efforts, and we're really trying to get from the science now to the people that are struggling or just working hard to be healthy, to prevent struggle.
That's that implementation gap. I'm going to come back to that in a second, because I think it's particularly important when we narrow down into that workplace context that I mentioned. So you lead a global coalition of employers that are trying to transform the approach to workplace mental health. and it's called One Mind at Work. So to drill down on that, in order to transform something, to transform an approach, it would suggest that there's some future, or at least alternate state out there that's better than the current one. So let's start there. How would you characterize the current state of workplace mental health?
Well, a lot of people think the pandemic has created major challenges around mental health at work. And the truth is that people were struggling significantly, and there was a growing struggle trend prior to the pandemic. So here we all were, growing struggles, harder and harder to be mentally healthy. And then the pandemic hits, and we're all home or working in hybrid workplaces, uncertain, fearful political dynamics, family fights, all kinds of things. And that struggle has gone almost straight uphill. So the current state is difficult. The house was on fire before the pandemic. The pandemic's kerosene. It's accelerated challenge. And the good news, or the silver lining, is many global corporate leaders, business leaders, employers have woken up finally to this reality. And one thing that's really important to clarify right at the beginning, Mark, is we view mental health as a continuum we're all on. So as people are listening, they should think about this as themselves, as all of us, just like physical health. And there are things to do to be healthier, and there are things that can happen or that you can do that make things worse. And that's true of the workplace as well.
So let's talk about some of those things that specifically people can do. What can workplaces as an environment specifically do better, or what's the core of the better approach that you're trying to lead them toward?
There's a long list of really good science, been around for decades, where we recognize that a workplace can be made more conducive to psychological safety. Many well-being programs, unfortunately, focus on what individuals need to do to be healthy. Climb the stairs, drink less diet soda, get plenty of sleep. Those things will make a person healthier. But what if they don't? Are there things that can happen that can help them thrive even if they do nothing? That's where we focus with workplaces. What can we do in workplaces that help people to thrive even if they do nothing? Well, they need to have supportive supervision. The workplace needs to have adequate access to resources and support for treatment and diagnosis. There needs to be a lowering of stigma, because it's scary to talk about these things, but if we don't talk about them, they get worse. So workplaces can open up and allow people to feel safe. Workload has an impact in the way that workload feels. Tom talks about purpose. He talks about people. He talks about place. And workplaces have all three of those dynamics that come to life and help people to be healthier or less healthy. And leaders hold the steering wheel, in a sense, to ensure that those things happen. There's a longer list, but those are some good examples.
Now, that idea, you mentioned the role of leaders here. What is the role of leaders? Because there has to be, you can't do recovery to people. You can't do movements to people. There has to be grassroots kind of swell. But what can leaders do to really cultivate that?
Well, one thing, if someone is in leadership, they should realize their primary objective needs to be to help other people thrive. And if a leader doesn't get that, they're probably in the wrong line of work. Leadership is about helping other people to thrive. So there is an ownership that comes with that. Grassroots efforts in companies struggle mightily because many things are at the policy and culture level, and it's very hard to change those from the grassroots. Grassroots can get men talking more openly in a department. Grassroots can get women feeling a supportive peer network. But grassroots can't change company policy, can't change the culture, can't change the design of the workplace or the environments of work. That's why leaders are there. And there's a lot of important work to do, years of work to do, to address those kinds of actions that only leaders can really take hold of.
Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, I hope this doesn't sound like too simple of a question or too basic of a question, but what's the point here? Well, what are the outcomes we can expect, or the evidence-based return on investment? There's the human case, but there's a business case here too, right?
There is, yeah. And people can and will continue to study this, and it always ends up around a 4-to-1 return on investment in the mental health at work efforts. When you invest in access, when you invest in culture, when you invest in the thriving minds in the organization, there's about a 4-to-1 return on investment in several different analyses of the topic. It's probably intuitive to most leaders. If it's not intuitive to a leader, then we're always a bit concerned about that person's wiring. The only value an individual brings to their company, no matter the industry, is contained in their mind. So if it's not intuitive, that addressing and enabling and really allowing someone's mind to be healthy and to thrive, if that's not intuitive, we do worry about those organizations. It's interesting because the science also says that there's this strength and struggle paradigm. They come together. The strongest, most creative, most brilliant people are more likely to have complex struggles in their life as well that pair with that strength. And the best organizations, of course, are going to recognize if we want the strongest people, the most creative, the most brilliant people in our company, then we are going to need to prepare for the kind of leadership, the empathetic, supportive, really well-trained leadership that can help us manage the struggle with that individual so that we can get full value out of the strength.
One of the barriers, I think, that workplaces, especially at the executive leadership level, face to implementing these kinds of changes is that sure, there's lots of free or low-cost interventions, but I think my personal view is if you want to do it right, you have to invest in your people and in their health and well-being. But the timeline on that return isn't always on a quarterly basis. It might not even be on your year-end statement. So what can you tell the people, to executive leaders in particular, to manage expectations with their shareholders or whoever it is around the eventual outcome of these kinds of investments?
Well, I'll take that in two quick parts. The first is that many of the things leaders can do that they're not doing are free to do. One, leaders can talk about this themselves and they can share their own stories. The front line will not typically lead on vulnerability. Leaders should get off the pedestal and talk about their own challenges and struggles and the day they use the EAP. And that starts to open the organization up. Organizations can form employee resource groups, peer support networks, put very little money into it, but it starts to warm the organization up and change the culture. The second part of it is, yes, companies are already investing millions of dollars in supportive capabilities, but no one is using them. These capabilities are charging companies a per seat or a per member per month rate. They're very expensive and unused. They won't become more expensive as people start using them. So organizations have a responsibility to get the culture to a point where people feel safe using the resources, to get awareness to the point where people are aware of the resources. And then as they start to use those resources, it starts to really help change the conversation without a significant increase in spend. There aren't many organizations today that don't have an employee assistance program. Most large organizations, at least, do have some kind of digital access they've created. And of course, mental health access in their health plan and benefit structure. If they don't, you're right. That's elementary, and that investment will pay off, and boards need to be reviewing the new ISO standards and the WHO statements and things like that. But much of this is really about fully maximizing existing capabilities that companies have.
Yeah, especially the existing strengths, because, not every company is
Correct.
All bad at everything. Actually, companies I've found do some really good things that they're maybe just not leveraging in the same way. So,
we
I want
see
to come
that
back
too.
Yeah, no, please go ahead.
Well, our members, 150 members, they all have stories to tell of real successes and real strengths. Nobody's at zero. Nobody's at 100 either. So one thing when companies join our movement, we always say, you come to teach and you come to learn. And they really do both.
Yeah. I mentioned I wanted to come back to that learning piece or the implementation piece. Lots of people know what's right to do, but it's difficult often to do the right thing or to do good things for your employees when there are a variety of different competing interests and barriers. So, in my perception, I think we had a few really good breakthrough years of mental health awareness, when it was new-ish and exciting. It was never new, but then to a degree, a few years ago, it seemed like we seemed to plateau, like we had reached almost peak mental health, where millennials, Gen Z, and others were kind of like, yeah, of course we talk about mental health. So now what? People were talking, but I think they were struggling to make the jump into action. Now, however, you mentioned the pandemic at the top. It seems like there's been a very real resurgence in interest and practical application and real actual transformation of businesses. So all that context considered, what kind of momentum have you been noticing in your global networks with the employers rather, that you're working with? Is there actual movement happening, or is it still just a lot of lip service and big A awareness happening?
Right. There's still a lot of lip service for sure. I think a lot of times busy leaders are just looking for simple solutions to complex problems, and it's hard to make headway. But there is a lot of legitimate interest and activity in this space. There are new measurements being created. There are systems of performance improvement companies are implementing in this space. There are advocates in the workplaces and even mental health leaders or well-being leaders that are more and more focused on this mental health in the workplace effort. There are leading lights. There are companies that are training all their managers, that are hiring different types of people, that are changing this conversation considerably. We worry, as you do, I'm sure, about the attention span of business and of leaders. And that is something we should continue to worry about, because the aftermath of a pandemic or any traumatic event is years of mental health struggles that elevate. There's been a study of many historic events, and it always happens. So there will be a long tail around COVID of additional mental health struggle, even beyond the run rate before. And that's something I think the wisest leaders understand will need to be on the agenda for a long time.
Yeah, we've been doing the work of awareness in earnest, I think, for probably a decade by now, maybe. But now the work begins. So I thank you for leading the way in advancing that message. Daryl Tol is Executive Vice President of One Mind, leading their One Mind at Work initiative. Thanks so much for joining me today, Daryl.
Thank you, Mark. Great to be here.
This is the Lifeworks Living Well podcast. We'll be right back. We're almost out of time, but before we go, I'd like you to hear from just one more person. Paula Allen is the Global Leader and Senior Vice President of Research and Total Wellbeing for Lifeworks. Paula, thanks for coming back on the show with me today.
Always a pleasure speaking with you, Mark.
I'd like you to tell me a bit more about the Lifeworks Wellbeing Platform and EAP services.
Well, for sure, there's a greater appreciation, but there's also a greater need where interweaving work and mental health and the impact on both on each other has never been greater. So Lifeworks has done a number of things. We have our well-being platform that basically puts well-being in the hands of every single employee and their family members, wherever they are, whether they're working hybrid or remote or traveling or anywhere. And we've also made it a little bit easier. One of the initiatives that we have is in partnership with Microsoft. We know that there's a number of organizations who are using Microsoft Teams as a way to communicate, and people are living inside that platform. So we've integrated it as part of that technology as well.
That's incredible. So now what kinds of support are employees getting through Lifeworks?
Basically, it's designed to give you the type and level of support that you need at any given moment. So there's practical information around, how you can manage challenges that everyone has, like with children, with speaking about the pandemic to your children, with time management, things that cause us undue stress, right through to in-depth support with a counselor. So everything in between is available, from video counseling to self-service mental health programs to group programs, but it's a full continuum of services, again, intended to give every single employee and family member the type and level of support that they need at that moment.
Where can listeners learn more and maybe even get access to Lifeworks EAP services?
You can reach us. Our contact information and all the locations where we do business is available on our website, lifeworks.com. And a Lifeworks professional will be very happy to help you understand the best thing that's available for your organization. And if you're an employee, really ask your human resources department, ask your manager what kind of support is available to you. You may not know, because sometimes we have other names that we present ourselves in organizations. You may not know that you have access to everything that I had mentioned, and we certainly want to make sure that you do know that.
Paula Allen is the Global Leader and Senior Vice President of Research and Total Wellbeing for Lifeworks. Thanks for joining me today, Paula.
A pleasure.
Thanks for watching and listening to the Lifeworks Living Well podcast. Many thanks to all of my guests, Dr. Thomas Insel and Daryl Tol, and thanks to you, as always, for listening and watching as well. Make sure that you like and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening or watching: YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and everywhere else. You can go back and check out all of the episodes from our 3 seasons so far on any of those platforms, as well as at livingwellpod.com. You can connect with me directly on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube at Mark Hennick, and let me know what you thought about today's show. If you found it helpful, please share it with your networks. Thanks again for the gift of your time today. I've been your host, Mark Hennick. Until next time, take care and live well.